I love crochet, and I love knitting as well. And I think anyone who does one of those could probably learn to love the other one too. After last week's video all about how to learn new crafts fast, I had messages from a couple of crocheters who are trying, or at least planning, to learn to knit, asking for any sage advice I might have for them. So here it is, in the form of yet another me just talking to the camera tips video, but you know what, I've got a lot on my plate at the moment, so we're just gonna go with this for the time being, okay? If you're new here today, hello, my name is Michelle and I love to do all of the crafts, but especially the stitchy ones. On this channel you'll find a healthy mix of cross-stitch, yarn crafts and sewing, with a little bit of miscellaneous and a lot of enabling. So if that sounds like your sort of thing, feel free to stick around and say hello. Everybody else, you know the drill by now. You're awesome, I love you, and eventually I am going to convince all of you to do all of the craft, so let's just do it. Okay, so tip 1 for crocheters who are learning to knit is to set some expectations around things that are going to be different to what you are used to. For example, it's quite common in a crochet project to use a lot of different stitches. Single crochet, double crochet, half double crochet, front post half double crochet. But the thing with all of those stitches is that they're all quite similar in terms of how you do them, just with minor differences like where you insert the hook or how many initial yarn overs you do. This means once you really have your basic single crochet stitch down, you can learn the others like that. In knitting, you'll find that the knit and purl stitches make up the bread and butter of what you'll be doing most of the time, so there's kind of less variety in that respect. But knit and purl stitches are actually quite different to each other and need to be learned as separate things. Increases and decreases are another example. In crochet you basically do them the exact same way every time, whereas in knitting they come in different forms that lean in different directions and again are quite different to each other in terms of what you're actually doing with your hands. So to sum up, and this is obviously all dependent on specific projects, in knitting you'll often have less variety of stitches within a project, but more variety in terms of how those stitches are made. Another big difference is that knitting is generally slower than crochet, all other things like yarn weight and size of project being equal. This is just because crochet stitches are naturally chunkier than knit stitches, so it stands to reason it takes less of them to fill up the same amount of space. Those smaller stitches are what gives knit fabric its great drape compared to crochet fabric though, so it's not all bad by any means. One other thing you might have heard about knitting as compared to crochet is that it's much harder to fix your mistakes. To that I would say it is and it isn't. It's kind of just different. I want to talk a bit more about this, so I've made it its own tip later on, but for now, setting expectations, all you need to know is it's possible to fix mistakes in knitting, sometimes even easier than it is in crochet. Okay, tip 2, and it's a difficult one. Accept you are back to basics. Remember when you were first learning to crochet and you felt like you had too many hands but also somehow too few at the same time? I bet you had trouble even keeping your stitch count the same from one row to the next, right? Well, you're gonna be back there for a while. Knitting and crochet are similar skills in a lot of ways, so I see quite a lot of people coming from one to the other and expecting to just be instantly good at it. But they are actually quite different in terms of the basic mechanics that you need to learn, so there's absolutely no shame in being a beginner again, and I think it's helpful to be realistic with yourself. Back when I was at uni, I joined the Knitting Society for a bit, and a new person turned up one day asking to be taught how to cast on. So I had her sit next to me and copy what I was doing step by step, and all was going fine until about halfway through the process. Every time she would just sort of do something and end up with a tangle, and I couldn't figure out what was wrong. It turned out she was already a confident crocheter, and the problem was she was getting to a certain point in copying what I was doing, and then the crochet muscle memory was taking over and just sort of automatically doing the wrong thing that I guess felt right to her in the moment. Once I realised that was the problem, it was fine. We took a step back, looked at what she was doing versus what she should be doing, and we got her casting on no problem. But it was just kind of hilarious that she didn't even notice the crochet hands taking over. So yes, it might be frustrating to be a beginner again. It might go against every fibre of muscle memory in your being. That's just the way it is, but persevere and you will get the hang of it in no time. Tip 3 is that you might be more comfortable with continental knitting. Basically, there are two main methods in knitting. We have English or throwing style, and then continental or picking style. Everyone has their preference, both of them have pros and cons, and once you get to the level of doing complicated colour work, you're probably going to be using both of them in the same project anyway. The main thing that sets these two methods apart is that in English knitting you hold the working yarn in your right hand, and in continental you hold it in your left. And which hand are most crocheters used to holding the working yarn in? Yeah, it's probably your left. So for that reason, I know a lot of people coming from a crochet background tend to take more quickly to continental knitting. Obviously, your mileage may vary, but it's definitely something to look into. The big downside is that most tutorials tend to be made for English style knitting, but if you just throw continental into your keyword search, you should find plenty. Okay, tip 4. Remember knitting works in columns, not rows. To unravel crochet, pull on the working yarn, and you'll see it comes apart one stitch at a time, horizontally across your work. In knitting, you can do the exact same thing. But of course, the big difference is that in knitting, you're left with all of these loops rather than just the one we had in the crochet piece. This is because knit fabric is made up of columns of stitches rather than the rows we're used to in crochet. And of course, each individual column can also unravel if the top loop is dropped. This is very important when it comes to fixing mistakes, which we'll talk about in just a second, but it also means those mistakes are easier to make in the first place. Don't worry though, there are a couple of easy things you can do to help prevent such a disaster. Counting your stitches is important in crochet, but it is crucial in knitting. Cannot emphasize that enough. We've just seen how easily a column of stitches can unravel. So if you've just completed a row and you've dropped a stitch in there somewhere, you want to know about it ASAP before it has a chance to drop down too far. Everybody hates counting stitches, I know, but it saves you so much grief as a beginner, so just do it. Lifelines are also quite common in knitting, whereas as far as I know, they don't even exist in crochet. I could be wrong, I've never seen one myself. Because crochet stitches are actually knots, they're basically self-sealing and all you ever have to worry about is that last active loop on your hook. But with knitting, all of those active loops on your needle mean more room for error. So that's where your lifeline comes in, which is essentially a save point. To use a lifeline, once you've finished a row and you're happy with it, you've counted your stitches and everything is correct, take a piece of thread or thinner yarn and thread it through every loop on your needle. This secures those stitches so that any mistakes made on future rows can't unravel any further than that line. You generally see this used with lace knitting, where fixing mistakes is way more complicated, but as a beginner, I'd recommend giving it a go. It's just that extra bit of confidence that even if everything goes horribly wrong, you're not going to lose too much work. Okay, tip 5. Fixing mistakes in knitting is something you want to learn early on. At the beginning of this, I said fixing mistakes in knitting isn't necessarily harder than in crochet, it's just different. But because it's different, people assume it is harder, or in some cases, even impossible. Just no to all of that. In crochet, to fix a mistake, you'll basically just pull on your working yarn until the whole thing unravels stitch by stitch and you get back to where the mistake was. That's great if your mistake is just a few stitches back, but it's the worst if your mistake is a few rows back, as then you'll have to unravel the whole thing back to that point. Either way though, there isn't really anything special to learn about how that works. With knitting, you can absolutely do the same thing. If you've made a mistake a few rows back, you could totally take out your needle, unravel the stitches by pulling on the working yarn. The only difference is you'll need to pick all of those active loops back up afterwards before you can carry on. Or you could just learn to fix mistakes by picking up stitches in a column and all of that precious knitting could stay intact. I know which one I choose. You can of course look up much more detailed tutorials on this, but I would encourage you not to be afraid to drop a column on purpose, especially if it's just in simple stockinette stitch like this, and especially if you've got a lifeline somewhere down there that's going to stop it going further than you want. And you're a crocheter, so you'll be happy to know a small crochet hook is by far the handiest tool for picking the stitches back up. No worries. Okay, so I've hopefully given you a rough idea of what to expect when you're moving from crochet to knitting. Obviously there are lots of other differences, but these are the main concepts that I've seen people struggling with. If you already do both crafts, please share your tips down in the comments, because I'm sure I missed some really good ones and you could really help somebody out. As always, thank you very much for watching. I'll be back soon with some more crafty nonsense, so in the meantime, have a brilliant rest of your day and keep making cool stuff. Bye!